There are moments in life when silence lasts so long that when it finally breaks, it doesn't come out loud, it comes out real. No anger, no chaos, just truth. And truth like that doesn't need volume. It hits differently. It sits heavy. It lingers. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. That's exactly what unfolded when Mykelti Padron sat down with her husband Tony and spoke in a way no one saw coming. This wasn't the version of her people were used to, the careful, balanced daughter trying to keep everything peaceful. This time, there was no filtering, no protecting, no holding back. Just honesty, raw and unguarded. She looked straight ahead and spoke about her father, Kody Robyn, and Robyn in a way that didn't feel like drama, it felt like clarity. And that's what made it so powerful. There were no raised voices, no emotional outbursts. Just a woman who has lived it, grown through it, and finally understands it. What she revealed didn't feel like new accusations. It felt like confirmation. Like someone finally putting into words what people had quietly been noticing for years. And when that kind of truth comes from a daughter, not an outsider, it hits on a completely different level. It stops being gossip and starts becoming something much deeper. She talked about something simple, yet incredibly revealing. The idea of a father being emotionally present. Not just physically there, but truly there. And according to her, that presence was never really felt. She explained how time with him always came with conditions. It wasn't about stepping into his children's world, it was about them adjusting to his. Everything worked on his terms, his timing, his structure. And over time, that creates a gap. A quiet distance that grows without anyone noticing, until it's too big to ignore, because there's a difference between a parent who shows up and a parent who connects. And children always feel that difference. Even if they don't have the words for it at the time years later, those feelings don't just disappear. They stay. They shape you. And hearing her speak about it now, as a mother herself, you could feel that weight. Not bitterness, but understanding. The kind that comes after you've processed everything and finally see it clearly. What made it even more striking was the contrast everyone has seen. The moments where warmth, patience, and attention seemed easier to give, just not equally shared. And that imbalance, it doesn't go unnoticed. Not by viewers, and definitely not by the children living inside it. She wasn't pointing at one isolated moment. She was describing a pattern. A lifetime of small things that, when added together, told a much bigger story. And then came the part that really shifted everything. She challenged the narrative. The idea that what was shown publicly always matched what was lived privately. She hinted that sometimes what's presented as truth isn't the full picture, it's just a version of it. And when someone who lived that reality starts questioning it, you can't help but wonder, how much of the story have we really understood? There was even a moment where she pulled back emotionally, almost distancing herself from the idea of parents entirely. And that didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like something deeper. Like someone trying to process pain while still holding on to love, because that's the complicated part. You can love someone, and still acknowledge what hurt you. Both things can exist at the same time. She also opened up about the reality behind the scenes, the financial struggles, the pressure, the difference between what people saw and what was actually happening. It painted a picture that wasn't polished. It was real. And sometimes, reality doesn't look the way it's been presented. Then her focus shifted toward Robyn, and the observations became even more precise. She talked about the way communication happens. The kind of words that sound open on the surface, but don't really reveal anything deeper. Phrases that create the feeling of unity, even when that unity might not truly exist. And over time, those patterns start to feel less like connection, and more like control over the narrative. It wasn't said with anger. It was said with awareness. She described how different people in the family had completely different expectations of what their lifestyle should look like. Some wanted closeness, constant connection, shared emotional space. Others were comfortable with independence, with separate bonds that didn't need to overlap. Neither side was wrong. But the problem came when one vision started being pushed onto everyone else, because forcing people into a version of life they didn't choose never ends well, and slowly, that pressure builds. It creates cracks, then distance, then eventually, separation. Even small details, body language, gestures, who stands where, who reaches for who, can say more than words ever could. And sometimes, Those quiet signals reveal dynamics that people try not to acknowledge out loud. When all of this came out, the reaction was immediate. Not because it was shocking in a dramatic way, but because it felt familiar. Like something people had sensed for years but could never fully prove. But the most powerful part wasn't what she said. It was the fact that she said it at all, because speaking like that about your own family, in public, takes something most people don't have. It means you've reached a point where staying silent feels heavier than telling the truth. And yet, there was no hate in her voice. No cruelty. Just honesty. The kind that comes from healing, not from anger. She spoke like someone who understands that acknowledging the past doesn't mean destroying it. That you can still care, still love, and still be real about what happened. And beside her, there was support. Calm, steady, present. The kind of partnership that doesn't interrupt, doesn't overpower, just listens. And that alone created a contrast that said more than words ever could. Because at its core, this wasn't just a conversation. It was a moment of truth finally finding its way out. Not to tear anything down, but maybe, just maybe, to be heard. And now the real question isn't what was said. It's whether it will be truly listened to, because sometimes the bravest thing someone can do isn't to stay quiet for the sake of peace. It's to speak honestly and hope it finally reaches the person it was meant for. If you felt that, if you've ever experienced something similar, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe, because sometimes these conversations matter more than we realize. There are moments in life when silence stretches on for so long that when it finally breaks, it doesn't explode, it settles. Quiet, steady, and painfully real. No shouting, no chaos, just truth. And that kind of truth doesn't need to be loud to shake everything. It lands heavy. It lingers. And once it hits you, there's no ignoring it. That's the space Mykelti Padron stepped into when she finally spoke. Not as someone trying to protect a story, but as someone ready to tell it. Sitting beside Tony, calm but completely unfiltered, she didn't come across as emotional or reactive. She came across as clear. And sometimes clarity is far more powerful than anger ever could be. For years, people watched, speculated, and tried to piece things together from what was shown. Small moments, subtle reactions, things that didn't quite add up. But no one inside the family had ever laid it out like this. Not this directly. Not this honestly. And what made it hit even harder was how normal she sounded while saying it. She didn't build it up. She didn't dramatize it. She simply explained what it felt like growing up in that environment. What it felt like to have a father who was technically there, but not truly present in the way that mattered. Because being around physically is one thing. Showing up emotionally is something else entirely. She described how time never really felt natural. It felt structured, scheduled, almost like something that had to be managed instead of something that came from genuine desire. And over time, that kind of pattern creates distance, quietly, slowly, but deeply. It's not the kind of thing a child can always explain in the moment. But they feel it, they carry it, and years later, when they finally have the words, it all starts to make sense. She made it clear that it wasn't about one bad memory or one specific moment. It was about a consistent experience. A pattern that repeated itself enough times that it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like reality. And that's where everything shifts, because when something becomes a pattern, it stops being accidental. It becomes part of who someone is. She talked about how everything seemed to revolve around his timing, his availability, his terms. And when that happens, the relationship starts to feel one-sided. Like you're always the one adjusting, always the one reaching, always the one trying to fit into a space that was never fully made for you. And that kind of feeling doesn't just disappear with time. It stays. It shapes how you see yourself, how you understand love, how you connect with others later in life. Hearing her speak now, as a grown woman and a mother, there was a different kind of awareness in her voice. Not confusion, not even anger, just understanding. The kind that comes when you've had enough distance to look back and finally see things for what they were. And maybe that's what made it so uncomfortable to hear, because it didn't sound exaggerated. It sounded true. She didn't try to tear anyone down. She didn't attack, but she also didn't protect the image anymore. And that balance, between honesty and restraint, is what made every word feel heavier. For so long, the story presented to the world felt controlled, polished, carefully shaped. But when someone who lived inside that story starts to gently pull back the curtain, even just a little, everything changes. Suddenly, the small things people noticed over the years don't feel small anymore. They start to connect, they start to mean something. And that's exactly what began to happen as she continued speaking. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about finally saying it out loud. As she kept talking, it became clearer that this wasn't just about feelings. It was about perspective. The kind that only comes with time. The kind that changes everything once you finally see it. Because for a long time, it's easy to accept things the way they are. Especially as a child. You don't question it. You don't analyze it. You just adapt. You learn how to exist within whatever dynamic you're given. And sometimes, that means convincing yourself that everything is normal, even when it doesn't feel right. But then you grow up and suddenly, the things you once accepted without question start to look different. That's exactly where she was speaking from, not the past version of herself who was still trying to understand, but the present version who finally does. She began to gently challenge the idea that what was shown to the world was the full truth. Not in a dramatic way, not with accusations, but with subtle honesty. The kind that makes you pause and think, because what happens when two realities exist at the same time, the one people see, and the one people live? She hinted that sometimes the answers given publicly didn't reflect what was actually experienced privately. That certain things were said in a way that sounded right, but didn't feel right to the people who lived through it. And that creates a disconnect. A quiet one, but a powerful one. Because when your experience doesn't match the story being told, you start to question everything. Not just the situation, but your own understanding of it. There was a moment where she seemed to pull back emotionally, almost like she was trying to create space between herself and the weight of what she was saying. And in that moment, it didn't feel like distance. It felt like protection. Like someone carefully choosing how much they can carry out loud. Because the truth is, speaking honestly about family is never simple. There's history there. Love, pain, loyalty, and trying to hold all of that at once while still being truthful. That takes strength most people don't fully understand. She also touched on something that added another layer to everything. The reality behind the scenes. The part that people didn't always see. The struggles that existed before everything became public. Before the cameras. Before the stability that came later. It painted a picture that felt more grounded. Less perfect. More human. And that matters. Because when a story is only told from one angle, it's easy to believe that's the whole truth. But once another perspective enters the conversation, everything starts to shift. Then the focus moved towards something even more subtle, but just as revealing: communication. Not what was said, but how it was said. She pointed out patterns in the way certain things were expressed. Words that sounded open, but didn't actually go deeper. Phrases that created a sense of unity, even if that unity wasn't fully real. And over time, those patterns start to feel intentional. Not necessarily in a manipulative way, but in a controlled way. A way that shapes how others see the situation, without ever fully exposing what's underneath. And that's where things become complicated. Because when communication stays on the surface, real connection never fully happens. It creates a version of closeness, without the depth that closeness actually requires. She didn't say it harshly. She didn't need to. The observation spoke for itself. And as she continued, it became clear that one of the biggest issues wasn't just behavior, it was expectation. Different people in the family wanted different things. Some wanted a deeply connected, emotionally intertwined life. Others were comfortable with space, independence, and relationships that didn't need to overlap constantly. Neither side was wrong, but the problem started when one vision became the standard, when one way of living was treated as a right way, and everything else was seen as less than. Because forcing people into a structure they didn't choose doesn't bring them closer. It pushes them apart, slowly at first. Quietly, but inevitably, and by the time anyone realizes what's happening, the distance is already there, hard to fix. Harder to ignore, even the smallest details, body language, gestures, who connects with who, can reveal more than words ever will. And sometimes, those quiet signals say everything people are trying not to say out loud. By this point, it wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a realization unfolding in real time, not dramatic, not explosive, just honest. And that honesty was enough to change how everything looked. By the time she reached this point, it didn't feel like she was just sharing memories anymore. It felt like she was connecting pieces that had been scattered for years. Everything she said carried a quiet certainty, like someone who had finally stepped back far enough to see the full picture, and that picture wasn't built on one moment, one argument, or one misunderstanding. It was built on patterns. The kind that don't stand out right away, but over time, become impossible to ignore. She began to describe how those patterns slowly shaped the entire family dynamic. Not in obvious ways, not in loud confrontations, but in subtle shifts. Who felt included, who felt heard, who felt like they belonged, and who didn't, because in any family, especially one that complex, balance matters. And when that balance starts to tip, even slightly, it doesn't just affect one relationship. It affects everything. She pointed out how different expectations were never truly aligned. Some relationships were built on independence, where space wasn't a problem, it was part of what made things work. Others were built on closeness, constant connection, emotional overlap. Both can exist, but only if they are respected equally. And that's where things began to fall apart. Because instead of allowing those differences to exist naturally, there was pressure to fit into one version. One idea of what everything should look like. And when people don't fit into that idea, they don't just feel different, they feel wrong. And over time, that feeling creates distance. Not the kind you can immediately see, but the kind you feel in small moments. In conversations that don't quite connect. In interactions that feel slightly forced. In the quiet realization that something just isn't the way it's supposed to be. She explained how even something as simple as gestures could reveal deeper truths. Who reached out? Who held on? Who positioned themselves at the center? And who was left on the outside? Those details might seem small from the outside, but when you live inside them, they mean everything. Because they reflect something deeper than words ever could. They reflect priority, they reflect connection, and sometimes, they reflect control. What made everything she said so powerful wasn't just the content, it was the way she said it. There was no rush, no desperation to prove anything. Just a calm understanding that didn't need validation. And that kind of confidence only comes when someone has already done the internal work, when they've already questioned themselves, processed their experiences, and come to terms with what they've lived through. She wasn't asking anyone to agree with her, she was simply telling her truth. And that's what made it land so deeply with people watching. Because it didn't feel exaggerated, it felt familiar. Like something many people have experienced in their own lives, just in different forms. A situation where love existed, but so did distance. Where presence existed, but connection didn't always follow. And hearing someone finally put that into words, it creates a sense of recognition that's hard to ignore. But maybe the most important part of all of this was what she didn't do. She didn't speak with hate. She didn't try to tear anyone down. She didn't turn her experience into an attack. Instead, she spoke with a kind of balance that's incredibly rare. The ability to acknowledge pain without losing compassion. To be honest without being cruel. Because the truth is, those two things can exist together. You can care about someone and still recognize what hurt you. You can love someone and still admit that they weren't always what you needed. And that doesn't make the love any less real. It just makes the truth impossible to ignore. Sitting beside her, there was also a quiet contrast that didn't need to be pointed out directly. The way she was being listened to. The space she was given. The support that didn't interrupt or overpower her voice. It was steady. Respectful. Present. And sometimes, seeing that kind of dynamic side by side with everything she was describing, says more than any explanation ever could. Because it shows what was missing, without having to say it outright. By the end of it, this wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was something deeper. Released at a moment where silence finally gave way to honesty, not to create conflict, but to finally acknowledge what had been there all along. And now, the question isn't whether people heard her. It's whether it will actually be understood. Because there's a difference. Hearing something is easy, understanding it requires willingness. It requires putting aside defensiveness, letting go of control, and actually sitting with what's being said. And that's not something everyone is ready to do. But maybe that was never the point. Maybe the point was simply this: to say it out loud clearly without fear. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing someone can do isn't to stay silent to keep the peace. It's to tell the truth, and finally set themselves free. And if that truth resonated with you, if you felt even a part of that story connect with your own experiences, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts below, and subscribe, because conversations like this deserve to be heard, understood, and remembered. And maybe this is where everything truly shifts, not in what was said, but in what it means moving forward. Because once something like this is spoken out loud, calmly, clearly, without anger, it can't just be brushed aside. It doesn't fade into the background like drama usually does. It stays, it echoes, and it forces people to confront something they may have avoided for a very long time. What she did wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive, but it was incredibly brave, because telling the truth about your own family in a public space, knowing it might be misunderstood, criticized, or even rejected, that takes a different kind of strength. The kind that comes from reaching a point where silence feels heavier than the consequences of speaking, and that's exactly what this felt like, not an attack, not revenge, but a release, but a decision to stop carrying something alone. And what makes it even more powerful is that she didn't try to control how it would be received. She didn't soften it to make it more comfortable for others. She simply trusted that her truth, spoken honestly, was enough, because at some point, you realize that protecting an image can come at the cost of your own voice, and when that happens, something has to give. For years, the focus has always been on appearances, on maintaining a certain version of reality that feels stable, unified, and controlled. But real life doesn't work like that. Real relationships aren't perfect, and they can't be held together by an idea alone. They need honesty, they need effort, they need emotional presence. And without those things, even the strongest structures begin to crack. What she revealed wasn't just about the past. It was about understanding the impact of that past in the present. How certain patterns don't just stay where they started. They follow you. They shape your decisions, your relationships, your sense of self. But the moment you recognize them, you also gain the power to break them. And that's what this felt like. Not just reflection, but growth. The kind that doesn't come easily. The kind that requires you to look at things exactly as they are, not as you wish they were, and still choose to move forward. There was also something deeply human in the way she spoke, because she didn't pretend to have all the answers. She didn't claim perfection. She simply shared what she had come to understand so far, and sometimes, that honesty is more meaningful than any perfectly crafted explanation, because it's real, it's unfinished, it's evolving. And that's what makes people connect to it, because everyone is still figuring things out in their own way. What she did in that moment wasn't just about her story. It gave space for others to reflect on this. To think about the relationships in their own lives. The things that were said. The things that weren't. The moments that shaped them in ways they didn't fully understand until much later. And that's why it resonated so deeply. Because it wasn't just specific to one family. It was universal. The feeling of wanting to be seen, the need to feel valued. The quiet impact of emotional distance. Those are things people recognize instantly, even if they've never spoken about them out loud. And maybe that's why her words didn't feel heavy in a negative way. They felt freeing, like someone finally saying something that others didn't know how to express. And in doing that, she didn't just tell her truth. She made space for others to acknowledge theirs. Now, whether that truth is accepted, understood, or even acknowledged by the people it's directed toward, that's something no one can control. Because listening is a choice, understanding is a choice, change is definitely a choice. And not everyone is ready for that, but even if nothing changes externally, something has already changed internally, because once you speak your truth without fear, without anger, without needing approval, you take your power back completely. And that's something no one can take away. So maybe this wasn't about fixing the past. Maybe it was about finally letting go of it and stepping into something healthier, clearer, and more honest. Because at the end of the day, peace doesn't come from pretending everything was okay. It comes from accepting what wasn't and choosing to grow beyond it. And if this story made you feel something, if it made you reflect, even just a little, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe, because sometimes the quietest truths are the ones that matter the most.